5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're live.
Hey, future Broncos. Welcome back to another episode of Broncos Scoop. Broncos Scoop is supported by Cal Poly Pomona's Office of Student Success, Equity, and Innovation with the funding from the Department of Education Hispanic Serving Institute grant, Project Caminos. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your new host, Andrew Brodahl, a first-year civil engineering major here at Cal Poly Pomona, and a student assistant of Project Caminos in the Office of Student Success. Thank you for joining us today on this new episode of Season 5. On today's episode, I will be giving you the scoop on admissions to Cal Poly Pomona. We understand that admissions are a stressful process. That's why we have a special guest here to alleviate some of your questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you please introduce yourself and your role at Cal Poly Pomona?
My name is Jazmine Flores, and I'm the lead admissions counselor in the Office of Admissions.
Awesome. Since we are in March and students have finished their application process, what communications should they be expecting from Cal Poly Pomona?
So for a lot of students, we've already sent out admission decisions. Not all students have received an admission decision, so there are some that still haven't received that communication. Everyone should have already received a claim your account email, which is basically how to log into your portal. And then if you're a transfer student, you should have already received a communication about transcripts that were due on March 15th. But that's pretty much what they've received from our office.
Yeah, I remember that too. When I first did my application process, there was like a gap period from when I got my acceptance, and then I remember I didn't receive any communication. Like I had to make sure that I was checking my Cal Poly email, and then I was able to see all the incoming emails that I wasn't receiving on my personal email, and then they all started coming up right before May. And to lead into the next question, what are the upcoming deadlines for the admissions process?
So we just had our initial transcript deadline for transfer students only, which was March 15th. And then for both freshmen and transfer students, our intent to enroll deadline is on May 1st, meaning you need to accept your offer if Pomona is going to be the school you end up attending. And then after that, we have a deadline soon after of May 8th, and that's to register for orientation. But you can't register for orientation until you put your intent. So it's kind of one after the other. Big deadline that comes up after that is final transcripts, and that's not until July. So we end up going from quite a few deadlines all in a span of 2 months to a big stretch without any deadlines. So final transcripts for both freshmen and transfer students will be due July 15th, and then orientation will be held in the summer.
I think it's something that should be taken really into consideration with time management. For me, I had to do all these deadlines last year, and the academic year was a little bit different because it was coming right out of COVID. So now I see that the schedules are way more tight when it comes to orientation. Because for me, I was able to apply for orientation, I think until late June or July or something like that. But now it's way more in a tight schedule, and you want to make sure that you get that covered, because if not, then the admissions will be.
Yeah, if you don't, I think that's one of the things that sometimes students maybe not realize, and there's a lot going on, right? All of them are in their last semester of something, whether it's high school or a different university or college. If you don't do all of these things, your application gets withdrawn, right? And we definitely don't want that to happen. So I'm always just put it in your calendar, put a reminder the day before, obviously try to do things earlier than the deadline. But if not, just make sure you have it somewhere, because it can result in your admission being withdrawn. And then the path you thought you were going to take now turns out to be very different.
Yes, and that would be very, very unfortunate.
Yeah.
What are some key factors that admissions officers consider when evaluating applications?
So the CSU system in general does not have a holistic evaluation process, right? Unlike the UCs, where you're turning in letters of recommendation and you're doing personal essays. But we also understand that students aren't necessarily a GPA, right? And just because your GPA is one thing, that's not indicative of the work performance you may have, right? There's a lot of environmental factors that go into why someone's grades are the way they are. So what we like to do is we have what's called the multi-factor admission model. Well, yes, your GPA is still highly taken into consideration. We're also taking into consideration, do you work while you're in school? Are you in extracurricular activities? Are you part of things like Project Caminos, right? Do you have any leadership activities? So we are trying to see you more as a whole person and not just the GPA. Although, like I mentioned, the GPA still is one of the biggest factors when making admission decisions. So we're looking at all of that stuff when evaluating applications. And then obviously, do you meet minimum admission requirements? Because you need to meet those to be considered for admission, right? Meeting minimum admissions requirement doesn't mean you get in, but it means that we will actually evaluate your application.
When I applied and I had to take into consideration of my GPA, but I was worried that I didn't have too many extracurricular activities. I didn't work during high school, and I actually didn't really participate in any clubs or anything. So I was kind of worried. And I think I contacted one of the like admissions people and they gave me the list of all the stuff that they put on your application. And during high school, I was a big contributor to like charity events and stuff. There's this one charity that I contributed to, Rolling Deep for Charities. And I didn't know that charity work was part of extracurricular. So it kind of gave me an ease, and I was able to explain how it contributed to my leadership and how I was able to balance my GPA and charity work at the same time. And I feel like there's a lot more on the list than what students would expect than just work or clubs and organizations.
And I think a lot of times, especially around extracurriculars, they're thinking of just what they're doing in school. Mm-hmm. We want to also know what you're doing within your community, right? That maybe has nothing to do with your school. So I always tell students when they're filling out applications, anything you think could fall in that category, list it. You know what I mean? Because it's not going to hurt your application if you do so. It's like list anything you can think of that could fall into those categories, because it can only help you in the end.
Most definitely. How important would you say test scores such as the SAT or ACT are in the admissions process?
So when COVID was kind of at its height, right, that was kind of like, well, what are we going to do? Students can't take the SAT or ACT really anymore, right? Because they normally they go to testing centers or they take them in their classroom, and that wasn't happening. And so that's why the multi-factor admission model exists, right? It was basically bred from COVID, right? How are we going to evaluate these students now that we don't have test scores? Because prior to COVID, students were evaluated in a very numerical way, right? It was SAT or ACT scores and your GPA. That's all we made admission decisions based off. And as we know, not everybody are good test takers. They get nervous. And again, like SAT is not indicative of how someone can perform in college, right? And so now that's not taken into consideration at all. So a student technically, and this is for the CSU system, and I'm particularly talking about Cal Poly Pomona, but CSU-wide, they're no longer required for admission. So if you don't take them, that's okay. We don't use them at all in the admissions process. The only time SAT and ACT scores are used are for placement. That doesn't mean you can't be placed in math and English. That just means, we will or will not use your SAT scores to do so. So that's really how it factors in to the overall university in terms of like the admissions process. We don't utilize them at all at this point.
And I like that point that you portray to the students, because like for me, I remember when I was in high school, there was a weird gap where I think from freshman to sophomore year, everyone was talking about the SAT and the ACT, and they were like, oh, like you got to make sure you study and like prepare for it and this and all that. And I was like, and I was scared. And then comes my junior year, out of nowhere, they were like, oh yeah, like you no longer have to take the test. And I was like really confused, because there was like some people telling me that you do and some people that you don't. From my position, I was able to, contact Cal Poly and ask them, and they informed me that it was no longer. But now students get the information right off the bat that, it's not required at all. And I think that's very, very important.
And I think during obviously COVID, there was so many things that were like temporary and not temporary. And so we didn't, until I think last year, was this a permanent policy from the Cal State system, right? So everything was very fluid and no one really knew what was going to happen. And I also think it's important to note that like making admission decisions based off of just test scores and GPA, we know that a lot of people don't have access to tutoring for SATs, or even the prep books are expensive. And so really the SAT and ACT was a disservice to the students who don't have the same access as other students. So going this multi-factor admission route allowed us to do a more holistic approach without being entirely holistic, as that's not necessarily feasible for a system as big as the CSU.
To go back on the question I asked earlier, considering extracurricular activities and community service, do they play a bigger role in the admissions process, or are they about the same with the list of things you go over when it comes to considering students?
They play a role. I won't say that they give you a ton of extra points, right? As a lot of it is still based off of your GPA, but you could technically be missing out on a lot of points if you don't answer our questions on the application that talk about these things. And they absolutely can help your admission, especially if you're like right on the cusp, right? If we admit because we admit off of what's called an eligibility index, which gets really complicated. So I'm going to try to just like explain it in very basic terms. It's basically, we take your GPA, we times it by some number, and then all of these other things like extracurriculars and things like that give you additional points, right? And so we have an eligibility index cutoff that we admit at, right? So for computer science, it's going to be some number. For liberal studies, it's going to be some number. And sometimes, especially if you're like at that cusp, right, these extra points can really make or break your admissions, which is why I always advise students, take your time on the application, don't rush through it. Make sure you are really thinking about the questions you're being asked and answer them thoroughly and honestly.
Can you provide any tips for students on how to deal with university communication to stay on top of their admission process?
So I know we're kind of past this point, but if any like future applicants are listening or watching this, do not ever use your school email address. Just because school email addresses love to filter out things, right? They don't necessarily want a bunch of stuff going into people's inboxes that are not pertinent to that school. So I get calls all the time being like, I never received any communications from you. Well, it's because they're using one email address that is no longer valid, or that filters out all of our stuff. So the best email addresses to use on our application are Gmail or Yahoo. Even iCloud sometimes gets picky and doesn't want to like send our stuff to them. But in terms of communications, everything is communicated via email. You're not going to get any calls from us. You're not going to get anything in the mail, right? So it's really important for you to constantly be checking your email address and to make sure it's an email that you can continue to access throughout the year, because the admission cycle is about a year-long process, right? And you go in like December from getting one email from us and then getting nothing to then getting bombarded with a ton of communications from us. And so everything is done via email. We also do post things that are due on your Bronco Direct. So it's super important that you stay on top of your portal, because we're only essentially going to communicate electronically, and it's really easy to miss things.
Yeah, and to like reiterate on that, like I feel like this also combines with like time management. For me, what was really beneficial was to like get a calendar or write down on my notes like every single deadline to make sure, because when there's like that big gap of period, not only like do students get worried, but I feel like at the same time they're like a little bit confused. And then when all this stuff comes in, and if they're not like, if they don't have everything time managed, it's just going to get really complicated. And then either you're going to end up with getting your application withdrawn, or we wouldn't want that to happen. So I would, give a tip to you guys is to just really take into consideration of time management. For me, it was beneficial, like I just said, was to write stuff down by date. And then it makes things more simpler, because I think the problem with me is that I was just overthinking about it. And, I think that's what a lot of us do. We just overthink, and the process isn't too complicated. It's just more of staying on time, making sure things are managed. And from there, I feel like it's straightforward.
And usually you all are applying to multiple schools. Usually Pomona is not the only school you're applying to. So you're getting inundated with communications, and it's so easy to be like, oh, I already looked at that, or I'll come back to it later, right? And then you forget because you have a bunch of schools that you're, applying to. And so I think you're right. Time management and writing everything down really is the best way to stay on top of everything.
Would you be able to like make a basic breakdown of that admission timeline right before the intent to enroll starts?
So for first-time freshmen, we are only open in the fall. And for transfer students, which I can do a different timeline for spring transfer students, we are always open in the fall and usually in the spring, but that can change from year to year. So in terms of a fall admission, right? The application is open October 1st and closes November 30th. This is essentially usually for every single CSU. There may or may not be extensions to it, and that changes from every cycle. For those listening, October 1st to November 30th is the application period. About 7 days after you apply, you usually receive an email from us with your portal credentials, right? How to log in, all of that stuff. And then you hear nothing from us. And I think that's the part that makes prospective students really nervous, because they're like, did I do something wrong? Did I not submit my application? Did I miss an email, right? We're really usually silent during that time because we're doing initial reviews, right? We're now reviewing your application to see if you meet minimum admission requirements. And then in January, this is for transfer specifically, they have what's called an academic record update. And it's where the application reopens for them, so they can update their fall grades and then input any spring in progress coursework. And the time frame for that is pretty small. It's usually like January 3rd or 4th to the end of January. So you really only have about a month to do this. And then from there, we're kind of silent again, right? We're now starting reviews again. And then admission decisions start going out mid to late February, and we have until April 1st to make them. And then within that admission decision time, if it's a transfer, there's an initial transcript deadline. And then after that, everyone kind of has the same process with, again, starting with intent, then orientation, then final transcript deadline.
With everything that we talked about and took into consideration, what do you think is the most challenging part of the process for most students?
I think being able to keep everything organized in a time where they're still going to school. I think especially for freshmen, they're in their senior year, right? They're probably done with high school. They're over it. They want to be done. Same with our transfer students. They're in their last year at a community college, right? And they just want to transfer. They just want to get there. So I think a lot of times it can be very overwhelming. You know, you're getting a ton of communications from people. You're also nervous. Are you going to get into the school that you want? And if you don't, what does that mean for your future? A lot of it is nerves over, like you mentioned earlier, overthinking, feeling overwhelmed. And it's really good to have a plan in place, right? And also pressures to make sure you pass all of your classes, because that can take away your admission to any school, right? So I think just keeping everything organized and together seems to be the most challenging for students. Also, higher education isn't the easiest to navigate, especially for our first generation students, right? They don't have someone that they can go and ask, right? And so I was a first generation student. I had to navigate higher education alone. So I understand how challenging that can be. So my advice to anyone is, if they're feeling that way, if they're feeling, I don't know what's going on because these spaces aren't like they weren't for me, right? It's to reach out to your admissions office. Most admissions offices have an admissions counselor who I'm sure are happy to be able to help you. I know if anyone ever has questions about anything, I try to help them navigate as much as I can, or at least provide them the resources to answer their questions, right? Because our knowledge is limited, and if someone else is gonna be better equipped to answer them, then we should definitely be giving them those resources. There's nothing wrong with calling the school and asking for help. It can only empower you.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was actually the last question I was going to ask you for the advice. And to add on to that, I know there's some situations with students as well, and still in high school, where maybe it's that they don't feel too comfortable asking their counselor, or maybe there's not that many resources depending what high school they came from. So for me, in my situation, my high school didn't really have too many resources when it came to any college help, admissions, financial aid. So I went and I contacted Cal Poly Pomona, and I was able to get help by a bunch of resources on the CPP website. And I feel like that's something that like students should take into consideration.
Our website is such a good resource, but I also understand it's a lot of information and it can get overwhelming. So if anything, I always encourage students to please reach out to the admissions office, because at least that way you know you're getting the correct information, right? And if you're shy, we have a live chat that you can talk to us online if you don't want to call in person.
That's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed getting the scoop on admissions at Cal Poly Pomona.
Subscribe to our channel to never miss the scoop, and follow our Instagram at cpp.broncoscoop. If you have any questions or want me to talk about anything CPP related, email us at caminos@cpp.edu. Tune in for more.